My clock is showing noon, so I'm going to get started. My name is Angie Pilgrim. I'm the Director of Community Impact for the St. Croix Valley Foundation, and I thank you for joining us over your lunch hour on a really bright and beautiful day here in the St. Croix Valley. So thank you for being here. On behalf of the St. Croix Valley Foundation and our longtime partner and event sponsor, First State Bank and Trust, I am happy to welcome you to the second presentation in this year's Conversation of the Valley series. The mission of the St. Croix Valley Foundation is to enhance the quality of life in the Valley by supporting charitable giving, connecting people and programs, and encouraging collaboration. These conversations are one way we encourage collaboration, bringing individuals and organizations together to learn and to imagine how we might respond to current and emerging issues. This year, we're exploring regional resiliency. There's no question that the last 2.5 years have tested our region's resiliency. Yet we all work together in new and creative ways to meet challenges head on. And now we're able to take a step back and take some time to really reflect on what we learned so that we're stronger and more prepared when our communities are faced with future challenges. In January, we heard from Professor Steve Deller on the multitude of elements that contribute to building resilient communities. He reported that research suggests 2 factors really stand out: economic diversity and social capital, that networking and relationship building. Today, our speaker will expand on both of those components. Now, before I introduce her, we asked a few local community leaders, what evidence do you see of business owners supporting one another or communities supporting business owners? Let's hear what they had to say.
My name is Agnes Ring. I'm Executive Director of Family Resource Center, St. Croix Valley.
My name is Rick Bonlender, and I'm a business banker at Pillar Bank, formerly known as First Bank of Baldwin.
My name is Sheri Marnell, and I am the Director of the St. Croix Valley Business Innovation Center.
Hello, I'm Tamara Twedt-Close, a community banker at Bremer Bank here in Siren, Wisconsin.
At the base of a strong, resilient community is a strong economy. We are lucky in this region to have many businesses founded right here. In addition to providing local employment opportunities, many of these business leaders are vested in the community and give back through leadership and philanthropy.
So when I think about evidence that I see in business owners supporting one another, I'm fortunate to see this every day. At the St. Croix Valley Business Innovation Center, we are a business incubator where we have over 25 entrepreneurs, soulpreneurs, small business owners that create that entrepreneur ecosystem.
I can think of many examples where businesses support each other, business-to-business support. Most entrepreneurs lean on friends and family with prior business ownership, but not all entrepreneurs have those connections. It's important that these business owners find mentors or people that they can go to and talk over their struggles and learn about successes and where to find local support and resources and other vendors. And then, of course, talk to your local business banker. Your bankers have broad networks of resources that can support small businesses.
Talking about how the residents supported the businesses during the pandemic. Within Burnett County, banks, organizations, businesses, and the economical development leader shared information about the PPP funds. That led to 177 PPP loans between $18.6 to $36 million.
The value that I see is not only as a small business owner, it can be really lonely, but they also get to leverage each other's strengths, their learnings, their tips and tricks, not only from each other, but also from our quarterly meetings that we have with them.
But important is to just intentionally shop local. Word of mouth is so important for small business owners. They don't have robust advertising budgets.
One example of a strong business response is the weekly COVID-19 response call that the Hudson Chamber of Commerce sponsored. For more than a year, the Chamber facilitated a weekly call with participants from a broad spectrum of the community, included business leaders, municipal leaders, leaders in the faith community, county health and human services officials, school officials, elected officials, individuals, many who came together, one, to learn the facts on the ever-changing status of the situation, to understand more about the implications, and every call ended with this question: do you have any unmet needs that we can help address? The relationships developed over that period were certainly an investment in resilience that will continue to give back.
Community members saw the absolute need to support small businesses, not going to large stores due to the exposure. So they went to our small stores and realized that they can't lose these businesses. Community members also showed their appreciation to employees that worked on businesses during the pandemic by purchasing local gift cards, food, and small gifts. Some businesses actually had more income than the previous years due to people shopping locally.
And then finally, saying thank you, recognizing these people and encouraging them. Make sure that you let these people know that they are important to you and the community.
It's definitely a key contribution to our community resiliency because it provides support for our entrepreneurs. They, again, are going through a lot, whether they're pre-revenue or existing businesses up to 20 years old. They have each other to lean on, they have me to lean on, and they have our entire network.
Building resilience requires building relationships, and building relationships comes from collaborations and partnerships in the community.
Very good. A huge thank you to those important partners, Sheri, Agnes, Tamara, and Rick, for sharing your thoughts. This COV season, I look forward to, alongside you, exploring what we have learned about community resiliency and understanding what issues may still require our region's attention. Ultimately, it is our hope that this 4-part series will raise awareness and spark ideas. And we invite you to be thinking about one thing you can take away from today's presentation and implement with your organization or do out in your community. So a quick reminder, though we have everyone muted, we will have time for questions at the end. So please type any questions you have into the chat box, and you can access that at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to those at the end of the session. And now I am pleased to introduce Professor Tessa Conroy. So Tessa is an economic development specialist and assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She works in the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics and the Department of Extension. She studies community economic growth and development, small business dynamics, and entrepreneurship. She has been recognized for her research, outreach, and teaching. Her research and commentary have appeared in outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, MarketWatch, Wisconsin State Journal, Wisconsin Public Radio, and PBS. Most importantly, those who work with and learn from Tessa have such positive things to say. One student reported, she's capable of explaining difficult concepts to those with very little economic background. So I am hopeful for my own understanding today. Tessa's 19-page CV lists numerous publications, presentations, and accomplishments, and I am so honored to welcome her to COV. Turn it over to you, Tessa.
Thanks, Angie. That was really a nice introduction. It's so nice to be with all of you today and talking with Angie and others at the foundation. I'm so glad to be pulled into the conversation here. As we've talked, it's just become so clear that we have shared interests and that today is going to be a fun conversation. So I'll be talking with you today about community resiliency and entrepreneurship. And I think the video already gave a really nice preview, a really nice punchline for where I'm headed today. So I'll be thinking about that as we get started. So can everybody see the screen fine? Thumbs up. All right, great. So we'll get started. So entrepreneurs and resiliency, the approach that I took to the talk today is to think about this as two sides of the same coin. So we know from the research that entrepreneurs are critical to economic resiliency. I'll be sharing with you how new businesses are really important for adding back jobs that we lose during economic downturns, during those hard times. We'll talk about how entrepreneurs generate income growth. So when we think about replacing lost income, when we think about the wealth and well-being of our communities, entrepreneurs are linked to those outcomes. Entrepreneurs are linked to regional stability. So even trying to avoid or mitigate those downturns to begin with, entrepreneurs are part of that equation. And something that I don't think economists talk enough about, probably because it's hard to measure, it's hard to put a number on, but the way entrepreneurs contribute to the local sense of community. But I also want to emphasize today how entrepreneurs also rely on community. Sometimes when we think about entrepreneurship, we think about this endeavor where you kind of strike out on your own, you're going out by yourself to do something. And I think there are certainly elements of that independent spirit that are true to entrepreneurship. But I think as we talk with entrepreneurs and we hear about their experiences, we know that partnership, that relationship, the collaboration is really integral to the entrepreneurial experience. And for that reason, we know that social capital is really important to entrepreneurship. So I'm going to be linking with some of the ideas that Steve has already talked with you about. We know that entrepreneurs need strong and diverse social networks, and that each interaction, these face-to-face contacts with entrepreneurs and across the community really matter for building that network and contributing to that stronger social capital. So I'm thinking of this as sort of a positive feedback loop. I think that when we have strong entrepreneurs, that lends to the resilience of the community. And I think when we have a strong community that is building social capital, that is focused on relationships, that helps our entrepreneurs. And so I think that this can really be kind of a virtuous cycle in our communities. So the first component of the equation is job creation. I think as an economist, this is something we're often talking about. Where are the jobs coming from? And for a long time, we thought that jobs come from small businesses. That was sort of the latest economic thinking. And here I have a snapshot just for purposes of sort of demonstrating my point. This is job creation by establishment size for the US for 2019. So this is not to say where existing jobs are. We're going to ignore all the existing jobs and just look at where did the new jobs kind of over and above what we already have come from. And I have broken out job creation then by size category across the bottom. So we have very small businesses, 1 to 4, clear up to really large businesses over 1,000. And if we take the sort of SBA definition of a small business is under 500, we see that, yeah, small businesses do create a lot of jobs, about 85%. We might think, well, 500 employees is actually quite huge. And so let's look less than 100, still 65%, so 2/3 coming from those businesses, and wholly 1/3 coming from businesses with under 20 employees. So yes, it's true. I would say that small businesses create jobs and they are this economic engine for us. But I think we have learned as we've gotten better data, not just about size, but about the age of firms, is we've seen how important new businesses are for job creation. So it's not so much that jobs come from small businesses, it's actually that jobs come from new businesses and new businesses happen to be small. So here we have average annual net job creation by establishment size. So keep in mind that we have jobs coming from age 0 firms. So these are the brand new startup businesses. And we see positive job creation, really large positive job creation in this category. And that's because new businesses only create jobs. They can't cut jobs. There are no layoffs. There are no closures. And so only good stuff coming from the new firms. When firms start to age, though, and they start to mature, when we think about how their jobs are changing year over year, because those businesses can not only add jobs, maybe they're expanding, but they might also have layoffs or closures. So the net jobs added from those older firms is actually negative in the United States over the 20-year period from 1998 to 2018. So on net, our existing businesses are not adding jobs to the economy year over year. It's really those new businesses that are going to be so important for adding to net job creation. And I think that this is a really important story, especially when we think about the last 10 to 12 years coming out of the Great Recession. It seems like a distant memory now, but coming out of the Great Recession, particularly in rural areas, we had a pretty slow jobs recovery. It was really sort of tepid, lukewarm. Just about the time the pandemic hit, we had some of our rural areas finally getting back to where they were pre-Great Recession in terms of the number of jobs. And I think a lot of that had to do with the entrepreneurial activity. When we don't have new entrepreneurs entering with their businesses, we don't have the same level of job creation, and that has real implications, particularly in rural areas where job markets are a lot thinner. So let's localize this idea. What does this mean for the St. Croix Valley? So here I have some job creation data for the St. Croix Valley from 1980 to 2020. And we're doing the same type of exercise here that we just did. So on the far left, I have new jobs from startups. So on average, we have just over 5,000 new jobs from startups per year. And then if we look at existing businesses in the middle, existing businesses through their expansion, through their growth, are adding close to 10,000 jobs per year. The challenge is that those businesses then in the far right are also cutting jobs through layoffs and closures. And actually the jobs they're cutting exceed the jobs gained. So if we were to think about net job creation, we see that same pattern here, that in the St. Croix Valley, those new businesses are really important for adding to job growth, because on average, our existing businesses just aren't adding to net job growth year over year. I want to emphasize they're still very, very important, because a lot of existing employment is in those mature, older firms. But when we think about adding jobs over and above what we currently have, those are really going to come from new businesses. So again, when we have an economic downturn, when we're trying to get back to where we were, jobs-wise, entrepreneurs are really important. So the second kind of component here is income growth and poverty reduction. We see this sort of across the spectrum of size. So what I mean by that is that countries with more entrepreneurship have higher GDP. So on this sort of national country level scale, we see that entrepreneurship is good for growth, good for economic performance. We see it at the regional level. So if we drill down sub-national to counties, to regions, we still see that entrepreneurs are connected to income growth in both rural and urban areas. And I think it's really important to note that entrepreneurship is connected to rural poverty reduction. So even a place like Appalachia that sort of seemingly lacks some of the infrastructure that might be necessary to realize the economic gains of entrepreneurship, we're still seeing the benefits of poverty reduction. And so I think from a community perspective, that entrepreneurial activity has lots of spillovers that can be really positive. And then coming down just to the individual or household level, we see that helping low-income individuals become self-employed can help them out of poverty and reduce the need for the social safety net. So kind of regardless of what level you're looking at or thinking about how entrepreneurship can impact a country, a region, a county, a city, an individual, we see these positive benefits that I think are important for when we think about how does a person get back up on their feet, or even how does a region rebuild after a period of hardship. So this has become my favorite aspect of entrepreneurship to talk about. So entrepreneurs contributing to the local sense of community. So in addition to thinking about these economic indicators, I want to emphasize how small businesses can create and support local amenities, how they can leverage natural capital. So small businesses, the theater, the museum, the cafe, these are all ways in which businesses are contributing to the fabric of our community, leveraging some natural capital. We might think of ski towns, or I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and we have these great towns along the Columbia River where people can windsurf, and all of the businesses are sort of built around the culture of windsurfing and making use of the river through boat rentals. We think of the Wisconsin Dells leveraging a natural asset as part of their business community. We see businesses that provide specialty services, sell culturally specific goods, somewhere like Monroe, Wisconsin, that has a really strong cheese-making identity, and a strong Swiss heritage, right? It's not just that cheese making, it's that these businesses are leaning into that heritage, offering culturally specific identity. And when you think of a place, you are often thinking of the businesses that are there, and that has quite a range of implications, right? We might think of Detroit, that is this automaking place, and we have come to maybe think of Detroit as being known for what their businesses offer. Las Vegas at one end, and then we have really inviting and charming communities in Wisconsin like Mount Horeb with their community culture and identity, embracing Scandinavian traditions and that sort of thing. So this can really all just give communities their charm and character, and contribute to livability and quality of life. And this is something that I think is really important as well. The childcare establishment, even if it's not something that you think of like, oh, it's going to draw in tourists, it's really essential to the fiber of our community. I've talked to a number of business owners, and coming out of the pandemic, there are opportunities to expand. They have opportunities to grow, but one of the things holding them back is that some of their employees are constrained on how much they can work because they don't have childcare availability. And so when your workforce can't get to work because of childcare, that is going to be a constraint or restriction on how quickly we can grow, how quickly we can get back to where we were and beyond. The bank, really important. I had a great conversation with a local banker talking about the extent to which, sometimes as a local banker, they might be in a position to say, even if this loan or this opportunity doesn't make sense on paper, it's best for the community, so we're going to move forward with it. And so the bank can really have an important role in helping businesses grow, helping businesses get through hard times. I have another example here of a veterinarian who is telling me, we're going through a rough patch right now. I know I have some clients that can't pay me right away, but I know they will eventually. And so I'm going to move forward with these services, knowing that we're going to get through this together, and that when we're on the other side of it, I'll get, the bill paid eventually. And so lots of ways that these businesses, these people really rely on each other and can help get us through the hard times. I have a couple examples here of this kind of local sense of community. Leavenworth, Washington, this is a place with a strong kind of German and Bavarian heritage. They do a really vibrant Oktoberfest, and people, it's in the mountains. It has a sort of very Germanic feel to it, and it's become known for and celebrated because of that identity. And you can see along the street here the way the businesses are participating in this identity, the way people are coming out and gathering and enjoying that sense of place. Red Wing, Minnesota, I think another great example of a town with a strong identity, this riverside community that has embraced the sort of boating, riverside, historical nature of its place, of its downtown. And this has become, I think, a place that's really inviting people, look forward to visiting. It has a number of charming and welcoming elements. Fort Collins, Colorado. I spent a number of years here. Fort Collins, what I'm showing you here is actually a brewery tour map. So Fort Collins becoming known for, again, what its businesses have to offer. They offer a lot of things, but one of the things is beer. So upwards of 30 microbreweries in Fort Collins there. And not only do they have this brewery tour, but it's meant to be a bike tour. So in embracing that outdoorsy culture, embracing that natural capital that natural asset in some of the trails and the beautiful scenery, and really leaning into the sense of place, the sense of community, and coming together to offer something to community members. Pendleton, Oregon, I think, is another neat example of this. This is a place in Eastern Oregon that has really sort of embraced a cowboy identity and a Wild West sense of place. So it's home to one of the premier rodeos in North America. But alongside that, they have custom saddle makers, custom boot makers. They have their own whiskey brand. They have saloons. They really just embraced this identity, made themselves a place that's known for this type of character, and the businesses are so much part of that identity. So another element that I think is really important of thinking about entrepreneurship in the business community is how it relates to stability. So over time, some businesses will close and others will do quite well. And what we see in some communities that are really heavily invested in one particular industry, or even one particular business, one particular company, is that they're very vulnerable to the rise and fall of that industry or that business. So it's true of my hometown. We were very reliant on an aluminum company. when that aluminum plant closed. It was really devastating for my hometown, and it has had sort of decades-long ripple effects. I think that's a story we see a lot in Wisconsin, whether it's timber or paper. We might think of it too, again, kind of coming back to the auto industry. When one industry that is really important to a region or to a community goes down, it can leave the rest of the community really vulnerable to those spillover effects as it ripples through. So entrepreneurship can be part of taking a portfolio approach to economic development. So if we diversify, we are less vulnerable to the fluctuations of any one industry. So we may not kind of ride as high when one industry has a big boom, but we're protected from those economic downturns because any one fluctuation in one industry or period of decline could eventually be offset by growth in other industries. So this can really be a way of lending to regional stability. So what this means is, I think from an economic development perspective, is that we're less focused on sort of picking a winning industry, a promising industry that we think is going to do well, and devoting our resources to that one company or that one industry, that sort of a game of picking winners, and instead say, okay, we're going to take the approach of supporting businesses, supporting new businesses, small businesses of all kinds. And that lends itself to this portfolio approach, where it's not just one type of business or industry that's getting ahead, but we have lots of pockets of growth across our community, and that's going to lend to long-term stability. I also think entrepreneurship in times of hardship is part of the story of household stability. You might have heard the phrase necessity entrepreneurship, which I think can be sort of diminutive, that it can sort of lessen this pursuit of striking out on your own. But even if you're pursuing entrepreneurship out of necessity, maybe because your community has had a period of job loss and the job you had isn't there anymore, maybe because it's the pandemic and the job that you used to have, you don't feel safe doing that anymore. Entrepreneurship can be part of household stability, in that to the extent people can create a job for themselves, and that job has the characteristics that they're looking for, both in terms of maybe hours, flexibility, or safety, that this can be a way that households strategize, that they can earn an income that is part of stabilizing household well-being during economic hardship. So we have all of these potential benefits of entrepreneurship, and I think that that's exciting because we are seemingly in sort of an entrepreneurial renaissance, I would say. So establishment birth rates, or the startup rate, has been on a long run decline in the US for several decades. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One being that I don't think we're keeping very good track of the sort of gig workers and the entrepreneurs that are only working for themselves, just those kind of one man and one woman shops. But what's interesting is that during the pandemic is we saw this surge of entrepreneurial intent. And I'm calling it entrepreneurial intent based on the graphic that I'm showing you here. So this is annual business applications for the St. Croix Valley region, going back to 2004 through 2021. We don't quite have 2022 yet. And a business application, for those of you who aren't familiar, is like a social security number for businesses. So they're going to need an employer identification number to file their payroll taxes. And so what the census does is they identify these businesses when they apply for their EIN, and then they track them for a few years to see, does this indicator of entrepreneurial activity actually result in a fully formed business? And we saw this dramatic increase, so upwards of 20 to 25% increase in entrepreneurial intent in 2020 and 2021. This is true in your region. This is true in Wisconsin. This is true for the country. And I think what is interesting about this statistic is one, going into the pandemic, those of us thinking about entrepreneurship, I don't know, saw this coming. There was a lot of reason to be worried about what was going to happen to small businesses. And I think rightly so. Those first few months were really rough. And we saw really large declines in self-employment, particularly among people of color. But then it just came back with a vengeance. By the end of the summer in 2020, we were seeing this unprecedented amount of entrepreneurial activity based on these business applications. So people wanting to start a business. And I think a variety of factors contributed to that. Again, that sort of necessity story, people had lost their job and looking for creative ways to earn an income. I think the pandemic gave a lot of people pause about kind of, why am I doing this job that I'm doing when I would rather be doing something else? I'm going to pursue that idea that I've been thinking of for a long time. I also think the pandemic, and I say this not to minimize the difficulties that people had, but also created a lot of new opportunities. We saw a lot of new niches open up, new parts of the economy, consumer preferences were sort of changing in how we do things, how we received goods and services. And so this does seem to be a case where there is a lot of entrepreneurial activity and potential. And I think the challenge for us is thinking about, okay, with all of this budding entrepreneurial activity, how can we make sure that we realize the full benefits that we just discussed? The job creation, the income growth, the poverty alleviation, that sense of community. How do we make sure that these businesses actually go on to open their doors and become those fully formed businesses? I will say, I know, on job creation, here we are kind of in a labor shortage, a very tight labor market. So what value is there in adding jobs when we can't fill the jobs that we have as it is? And I would say that I think a positive spin on job creation, even in moments like this, is that those new businesses, we see a lot of productivity growth coming out of new businesses. I think that this can be a good moment for workers, to the extent to which we see employers competing for workers. I don't want to minimize those challenges, but this can be a time where workers, after long periods of not seeing much in terms of wage gains, might start to see those workers who are looking for certain job attributes in terms of flexibility that lets them take care of their families or deal with health challenges. They can start to search for those jobs that have those attributes that make sense for them in their household. So I think even in moments like these, entrepreneurship can still be a really important part of the competitiveness of a region. So we have all of these budding entrepreneurs. How do we leverage that into resiliency? And I have this quote here to start this conversation that I'm borrowing from the Kauffman Foundation, but it says, each month, 3 out of every 1,000 people in the United States will start a business. These 3 entrepreneurs take on a tremendous task and assume a great deal of risk. But the remaining 997 people constitute a community that plays a substantial role in the entrepreneur's success as well. In fact, we depend on these 997 individuals, those who are not entrepreneurs, to support the entrepreneurs. So I just emphasize this other 997 because I expect a lot of you in the audience are business owners, but even if you're not, you're still part of this other 997 that can be part of a strong entrepreneurial ecosystem and a strong entrepreneurial community. And I think what this quote is talking about is social capital. So connecting with some of the ideas that you heard last time, social capital. When we think about how we can support these entrepreneurs and make our communities stronger, I think social capital is really key to entrepreneurial success. Steve literally wrote the book on social capital. I'm borrowing his definition here. These are networks, norms, and trusts that facilitate coordination and cooperation for mutual benefit in a community. And I think thinking about social capital in this kind of broad, generalized way is really helpful for understanding how we can work together to support entrepreneurs and understanding the pieces that are important. I also, though, want to emphasize that when we're talking about social capital, there's an element of social capital that is happening within an institution and also across institutions. So the institutions being a point of emphasis in this definition because the bowling alley, the church, the place of employment, this is where people come together and they form relationships. This is where networks are built. Institutions, organizations, these groups help us establish behavioral norms and shared values, and it helps us see each other so that we can observe other people's behavior, notice when they do the things they say they're going to do, and see how their values align with ours. So the network, norms, and trust kind of falling out of this institutional perspective of social capital, being involved, being a member, joining up in that club and group, all can lend to social capital. So taking a closer look at those components, I want to start big picture here and point out that entrepreneurship is kind of most fundamentally can be framed as this exercise in combining resources. So entrepreneurs are bringing together lots of different types of information. They're bringing together money or capital, financial resources. They're combining talent of their own and maybe their workers and partners, bringing in various inputs to create a new good or service that they're going to be selling in the local market. And so networks, I think, are important because these are the channels through which resources flow. And this is basically just another way of saying it's not what you know, it's who you know. The way we access opportunity, the way we find a lending opportunity, the way we find somebody who's available for a job, oh, I know who would be perfect for that, is often through our networks. And this has been shown like quantitatively with research, but we know that opportunities flow through networks. So entrepreneurs really rely on relationships and who they know in combining these resources to start their business. I know that trust is essential to the usefulness of resources. So we want to have confidence in the reliability of information when we receive it. So maybe you get kind of an inside tip, but we want to know that we can have confidence and trust in that information. Same with source of funds. When we enter into a financial relationship with somebody, we want to know that that's a trustworthy relationship. Our relationship with workers, the commitment to and from suppliers, these are all most fundamentally about trust. And the norms I want to emphasize here too, because these can evolve to help or hinder entrepreneurship. So we think of some maybe community norms that would help entrepreneurship as openness to experimentation, creativity. Are we accepting of failure? Is there an attitude of openness or welcoming? These are all norms that can evolve in a way that supports entrepreneurship, but we can also imagine norms that evolve in a way that hinders entrepreneurship, that maybe we're not very welcoming, not very open-minded, that we are happy with the status quo. These are all things that can kind of culturally get in the way of entrepreneurship. So I have a quote here from some research from a colleague of ours, Diana Hammer, and in interviewing entrepreneurs, one of them said to her, I've never asked for any help. I've never needed anything. I don't ask for anything because I know they aren't going to help. When a person is Latino, they'll deny everything. So here I have kind of a counter example. I think we can imagine the way these verbs capture weak networks, low trust, and norms that are not supportive of entrepreneurship. And so I think each of these components is really helpful to understanding how social capital and how this community characteristic can be part of the entrepreneurial culture. Here's another one. Failure is a big part of entrepreneurial places. And so sometimes when we talk about entrepreneurial places, we might think of the Carolinas, we might think of New York, we might think of Colorado, California, Massachusetts, places that sort of consistently rank high when it comes to entrepreneurship. What nobody talks about, though, is that those places also have really high rates of failure. Failure and experimentation and starting a business go hand in hand. And so each dot on this figure is a county. And we're plotting the number of business openings against the number of business closures. And what you see is this really strong positive relationship. So oftentimes the same places that are quite entrepreneurial often have a lot of experimentation, a lot of things that don't work out, that don't go well. And I don't know that we always incorporate that into our entrepreneurial culture. Do we know that when we pursue this strategy, that when we embrace an entrepreneur, it might mean embracing and accepting and learning from failure so that we can get better for the next venture? So I think this is a norm that's really important, especially when we think of resiliency, right? Coming back from something that didn't work, thinking about what can be learned from it and moving forward. And we know that those places that have a lot of failure alongside a lot of entrepreneurial activity, it does seem to be that there's this learning mechanism that ultimately leads to a stronger region in the long run. So networks, norms, trust, these are the elements of social capital. Networks, just to go a little bit further here, these are the channels through which resources and information flow. I have this quote here: entrepreneurs rely on people they know and trust for information that is tacit, difficult to verify, nuanced, or locally specific. So much about being an entrepreneur isn't about learning the information that exists in a book somewhere. It's in somebody's head because they've lived it and experienced it. And so the relationship entrepreneurs have with other entrepreneurs are really important for their resiliency, for figuring it out. So we know that role models and peers are so essential. So when I see communities with mentor programs, when I see informal gatherings of entrepreneurs, we know that those are so, so valuable. And ultimately, this is the mechanism through which entrepreneurship leads to more entrepreneurship. Successes and failures help future entrepreneurs. So the extent to which we have a community of business owners, a community of entrepreneurs, and we can help them or connect them with the future generation, with the people who are considering entrepreneurship right now, we would expect that to help entrepreneurship spread across the community and realize those economic benefits that we talked about at the beginning. Beyond, though, being connected to other entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs also need to be connected to a variety of other contexts: bankers, lenders, lawyers, real estate agents, customers, suppliers, elected officials, economic development professionals. These are all really important relationships for entrepreneurs. And what this does is connect entrepreneurs again with resources. So here I have a map from some other colleagues in Extension, and what they've done is look at what I'm going to call the entrepreneurial food system in northern Wisconsin. Each dot is a member of that food system. They're either a business owner, a buyer, a distributor, a food system educator, a grower, a market manager, a restaurant, a producer, or have some other role. And you see this web of connections, and you can see the people that are really highly connected, and you can see the people on the fringe of this network that are really just sort of marginally attached. And so we can think of these relationships as opportunities to strengthen entrepreneurs and their businesses. It's opportunities to connect them with additional resources to help them be more successful. We can think about those people that are less connected and integrating them more fully into the network. And a concrete example of how this matters, I think, is the PPP program. So on the right here, I have funding sources used in the last 5 years and whether business owners are using a bank or credit union. And so we see that by race, non-Hispanic whites are most likely connected to a bank, and then Hispanics and Black or African American business owners being much less connected to the banking community. And so without that relationship in place for business owners, that had really very real consequences for their access to funds when the PPP program was implemented. This is emergency funding during the pandemic for business owners that was deployed through the banking system. And if you didn't have an existing relationship with the bank, those funds were harder to get. And so that disproportionately impacted people of color. So I think this is just a really concrete way of showing how relationships matter and connect us to resources and have consequences for the viability of businesses during hard times. Here's another way of thinking about it, that relationships are the webbing of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So the entrepreneurial ecosystem, if that's a new idea, just comprises all of the components that an entrepreneur is going to be interacting with and moving through in the process of starting their business. So capital, thinking about the culture, the climate, the regulatory environment, developing skills, the educational community within their town or city. All of these components are going to be part of the ecosystem, and the relationships that we have with people in different parts of the ecosystem are going to help us move through those efficiently and get the resources that we need to be successful. So I have sort of this conceptual design on the left side, and then a concrete example from Kansas City, where they actually are mapping those network relationships and understanding how an entrepreneur might be connected to different organizations across the ecosystem, and seeing that I think what's important here is it's the organization. This is an organization map, but keep in mind, it's not that I'm connected to the downtown council. It's probably that I know Angie at the downtown council, and that relationship, that introduction is going to be really a key part of me accessing those resources and utilizing them. So building networks, it's not enough to establish resources. Network connections facilitate knowledge of, access to, and utilization of resources. So again, that being generous with introductions, putting a face with a name, actually interacting with a person is really important. It can't be a build it and they will come sort of model. We need to extend invitations. We need to facilitate introductions in order to get people into these organizations. We need to be mindful that women, people of color, and newcomers may be at a network disadvantage, and this has real consequences for their ability to start and sustain a business. So thinking about how do we build social capital, how do we build networks in an equitable way? And we can talk more about this at the end. I know I'm getting close to time here, but this is one way that we talk about an extension with our network building activities is about starting with acts of generosity. It's so much easier to build a network by starting with an act of generosity than it is by starting with a take or an ask or a request. And this is all about developing a culture of support. We want an environment where entrepreneurs say, when they have an idea, the community responds with, we'd love to see you be successful. How can we help? I want to emphasize that networks are inherently local, that interactions matter. These are about face-to-face interactions. Online networks are important, they can sustain networks, but maybe they're not as good for establishing new connections. And those face-to-face interactions are really where we can facilitate seeing what somebody is about, knowing that they follow through on their word, that we can reciprocate when somebody helps us. So these face-to-face interactions are important. And the close relationships are often physically close. So we are often closest with the people who live in close proximity to us as well. So I think that's the nature of community. That's the glue. That's why places kind of adhere together, right? It's about the closeness in physical space. Our neighbors, our co-workers, our business service providers, our helpful organizations are all part of that. So the punchline here, I think, is that if we want strong entrepreneurial resilient communities, that social capital is really important. Social relationships are really important. And I think the beauty of that element is that that's going to form uniquely and evolve uniquely everywhere you go. So even if another city or town in Wisconsin or somewhere else could exactly replicate the education and industry and resources of Silicon Valley, they're still not going to be the next Silicon Valley because we can't control the way those social networks and social relationships form. And so social capital and networks play a large role in determining economic outcomes. Those can't be replicated. We're so much better off focusing on what our local strengths are, developing local relationships, than we are trying to replicate something that happened somewhere else. And so develop local assets, support local entrepreneurs, build relationships. I really think that's the takeaway of this kind of two sides of the same coin between entrepreneurship and resiliency. So with that, thank you for being gracious. It went a few minutes over time. I appreciate being with all of you today.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you so much, Tessa, for your comments and for being here today. We really appreciate that. What strikes me is just how intertwined it all is, not only your comments and how they relate to Professor Deller's from January, which, by the way, are available via recording on our website, but also how it ties back to the series we did last year on placemaking. I heard you say several times, place, place, place. So again, thank you. I'm keeping my eye on the chat. So if you have any questions, please type them there. But I'll get started with some of the questions that I saw come through while Tessa was speaking. Okay, the first one has to do with wages. What types of new businesses are most likely to hire people at wages that are high enough to enable them to live in our region? This came up at the last session with Professor Deller too. And how do we really encourage and incent those entrepreneurs to prioritize livable wages?
Yeah. So new entrepreneurs, I want to acknowledge, are in a tough spot. And when we look at the quantity of jobs, new businesses are great. When we look at the quality of jobs, new businesses are less competitive. To be honest, it takes time to get to a place where they can offer those competitive wages and incentive packages on average. But I think it's still the case that in general, we want to be thinking about the businesses who are competing based on innovation and are pricing based on value added, rather than sometimes businesses that are competing based on cost. That can be really difficult because the margins can be very thin. They're really limited on how much more they can add to their expenses because their competitive model is, based on cost. And so I think that's where maybe we see some of the excitement around businesses in tech, for example, where it's really a value added businesses, where as long as consumers are valuing what's being created, they're willing to pay that price point, then there's a growth edge for wages and adding benefits. So I don't know that I can put my finger on a specific type of business or even a particular industry, but I would say that kind of characteristic of competing on innovation is one that we talk about with colleagues.
Okay, very good. We learned that small businesses are obviously very important to job creation. You talked about that at the very start. Beyond our bankers, and I know there's several on the call today, so thank you to our bankers that are so supportive of our entrepreneurs. But beyond the bankers, is there other funding that's available for entrepreneurs and for that are especially just getting started, or other resources?
Yeah. So based on the best data we have, most businesses actually aren't started with a bank loan. We think it's somewhere between 10 and 20% that get started with a bank loan. So a lot of entrepreneurs are finding financing elsewhere. So one of the major sources that we say is friends, family, and fools. So leaning into their network, though, in all sincerity, to access resources. But even at the community level, we have rotating loan funds oftentimes that can be a good resource for entrepreneurs. I would like to direct people to their community development financial institutions, also to credit unions. Credit unions have been really growing in the business lending space. And then some places are also really creative in terms of pulling together, let's say, like a local group of investors that is interested in some equity financing. This can be kind of a small scale, maybe not as splashy as what we would see on the coast, but can make a lot of sense locally. Norm Walzer out of Illinois has a great book on community supported enterprise. So looking at models that engage the community in order to finance businesses. So this could be like a membership model. This could be a group ownership model where, a community says, well, we need this cafe or we need this grocery store. And so we're going to find a way to kind of all chip in and own it together so that we can sustain it in our community. So I think that there are lots of creative ways to think about financing. And I think those are really important because what we're seeing in the data is that small loans in that under 100,000 category are just harder and harder to find.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. These two questions kind of tied together and speak to what you talked about at the start related to economic diversity, and also tying in those different communities that are featuring, their specific heritage or tradition. How then can a community really foster a climate that's conducive for those new businesses that are unique or maybe different than that specific heritage or tradition?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is hard, and I think this is linked to some of the conversations we're having with communities right now about being welcoming and opening to people of diverse backgrounds, newcomers that haven't lived there from a long time. I'm from a small town where if you are, anything less than third generation, you're new. You're new in town. And so these like really established places. And so how do we welcome new people? Because when we welcome new people, we often are also welcoming their ideas and their approach to things and their vision of how it could be. And so I think a lot of it comes down to like what I would maybe call like the soft underbelly of the entrepreneurial ecosystem are those cultural norms, the openness, the welcoming, how we think about experimentation. I hear anecdotes of entrepreneurs who share their idea with, somebody, and that's kind of a vulnerable moment to share your business idea with somebody, and they get a response that's like, ooh, sounds risky, or, so-and-so tried something similar and it didn't work out. And, I'll give those comments the benefit of the doubt. I think people maybe are trying to look out for one another, but it's so much different to sort of think about changing that tide of support and to have community members say, that's so exciting. I'd love to see you be successful. What resources could I connect you with that would help you accomplish that goal? Not to say everybody should be an entrepreneur, but I would hate to see an entrepreneur with a great idea not be successful for lack of community support and access to resources that they need.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you for that. This is a question that's especially pertinent in this region, right along the river. For those communities that really thrive and businesses that really thrive because of summertime tourism, what do you see happening, or do you have any recommendations on how we support those businesses in the off season?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I think sometimes we might be inclined to view that as like a business problem or an individual business owner problem. And I think the more that communities are willing to step up and come to the table and think of those as a community challenge, how do we support businesses in the off season? How do we maybe bring people to our community in the off season? The more we can like kind of build a local brain trust around some of the challenges that local business owners are facing, I think the better off we'll be. So this might feel like a punt, and I apologize. I think the answer is probably different in every community in terms of how to support those businesses. I can imagine thinking about ways to diversify, thinking about alternatives, thinking about differences in marketing and community branding that might be really relevant. But I think, again, the more we can think about viewing that as a community challenge that we're going to bring the wealth of community knowledge and resources to, the better we'll be in a position to solve that particular challenge.
Absolutely. Very good. Thank you for that. One participant asked, there's businesses like a Chewy or a Hungry Root, those that are completely online and ship right to your house, or Amazon for that matter. How is that affecting the brick and mortar businesses, and have a whole bunch of businesses folded because of those home delivery options?
Yeah, I think that challenge is real. A number of years ago, we were sort of looking at the impact of these online retailers on local brick and mortar. And the results weren't favorable, as you would expect. So I'm sympathetic to those challenges. And so again, it kind of, for me, comes back a little bit to, a number of things that we've talked about. Some of you have talked about, buy local, thinking about not just the product or service, but is it valuable to have not just the product or service? Is it valuable to have it locally? And what does that mean for my shopping behavior? And so thinking about community support in that way. And so I think there's like the consumer demand side that we can work to encourage, but then I think there's also the business or supply side of the equation, which goes back to what I was saying about how can businesses differentiate from what's happening online, so that consumers are getting something that they couldn't otherwise, whether that's a customer service or some goods and services. It just makes sense to go get locally because you need to try it on, or you need to try it out, or you need the technical assistance, you need the expertise to get started. So I'm hopeful that there are ways, and coming back to these like culturally specific goods, I mean, I personally, my father-in-law is Swiss, and if I want to buy, some like Swiss item for him, like it's so nice to go to the store and like talk with somebody who's familiar with the heritage and what's meaningful and what's valuable, and to have that experience. So looking for ways that we can differentiate, create value added, compete on innovation, because those pressures from the large online retail space and even online service space are real.
Very good. And there's one specific question that I'm actually going to connect you with the person that asked the question related to some extension services that were provided in the Valley a few years back, but I'll do that connection offline because we're approaching the end of session. So I want to thank you, Professor Conroy. I want to thank our sponsor once again, First State Bank and Trust. I want to thank our planning committee, especially the committee chairs, Judy Freund and Rick Bonlender. Thank you. And I want to remind everyone to join us for the next program, which is on Wednesday, April 12th, and we'll be talking about Main Street and the contribution of Main Street to resilient communities, and that's with the Rethos Executive Director out of the metro area, Heidi Swank. And that registration will open in March. Finally, if you have any thoughts or comments on today's program, please complete the survey, which will be emailed to you, or give me a call or email, shoot me an email. I'm happy to hear from you and talk with you, and your input really is helpful as we plan for the future. So I thank you again for being part of these important conversations, and I hope to see you in April. Thank you, Professor Conroy. Really good to have you here in the St. Croix Valley.